United States of America houses many people who have different racial and ethnic backgrounds. In this video, I will talk about the top 4 ethnic groups in the United States. The history of African Americans goes all the way back to the year 1619 when the first slave ship brought 20 slaves to America. The slaves were brought to a Philadelphia port in the British slave ship Isabella. This marked the beginning of over 100 years of inequality for African Americans. Before being packed into the ships, Africans were brought to slave castles located on the west coast of Africa, one of which is the Cape Coast Castle in Cape Coast, Ghana. Built by the Swedes, thousands of Africans from around the west coast, including Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and the Ivory Coast, were marched for miles and miles to reach these castles. Once they reached the castles, they were separated by gender and put into different holding cells. The captain/overseer of the castle could rape the women as he pleased. If one got pregnant, they would remove her, wait until she gave birth, and throw her back into the cell. Once the ships came, they left through the door of no return, which only one is said to have returned from. If a person were to misbehave, they would not get the chance of being on the ship and would be locked in a cell which had no light or ventilation. They were kept there until they died of either starvation, illness, or dehydration. African Americans were crucial to the South economy as they provided the most labor on tobacco, sugar, and cotton fields. African Americans were kept in harsh conditions. They woke up and worked for 20 hours a day with little to no rest. As African Americans and other slaves had grown more upset, fears of revolts and strikes were common. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1793, which had made it a federal crime to assist slaves in escaping, which made life and the possibility of freedom harder for African American slaves. If they had attempted to refuse or weren't working up to their master's standards, they were brutally beaten and were sometimes hanged or killed in the process. Nat Turner's revolt took place on August 21, 1831, when he and other slaves from the Travis's family plantation had risen up and decided to revolt. This revolt all started when Turner and his gang, who eventually ended up with around 60 to 75 people, had murdered the Travis family. They then went on to murder 60 whites in the span of 2 days. The militia and resistance from armed locals led to a swift end of the revolt. 100 slaves and some innocent bystanders were killed during this revolt. After the revolt, the media in the South over-exaggerated the extent of the damage caused and sparked a mass wave of anxiety. Legislators had made stricter slave codes, which led to more oppression and tension between whites and African Americans. Nat Turner was later hanged after he was tried for his actions. During slavery, many slaves managed to escape through the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network of routes and safe houses set up by free blacks and sympathetic whites. Those traveling by the railroad had traveled under the cover of night, as the daytime would be dangerous due to the chance of getting caught by slave catchers or their masters. Harriet Tubman, also known as the conductor of the Underground Railroad, was one who frequently traveled the railroad. Harriet had hoped to bring over 300 slaves to freedom by making 19 trips to and from the South. 1865, President Abraham Lincoln passed the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery. The 11 Confederate states, who were mainly slave states, had strongly disapproved of Lincoln's actions. The Civil War, which occurred in 1861, was not necessarily in order to abolish slavery, but to preserve the Union. Although the 13th Amendment had freed the slaves from chains, they weren't fully free, as oppression and discrimination were still present. Juneteenth, also known as the African American Independence Day, as it was the day which the announcement of the 13th Amendment was made to African Americans who were still enslaved. In Texas, African Americans were still considered slaves until June 19, 1865, when Union soldiers, led by Major General Gordon Granger, brought the news to those still enslaved. Juneteenth is still celebrated to this day. The I Have a Dream speech was given by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on August 28, 1963, during the March on Washington. This march was attended by both whites and blacks in an attempt to gain equality. The speech had included many references to the Bible, the Constitution, and overall basic rights. Due to this, the speech was considered a large press during the African American Civil Rights Movement and has left its mark on history. Brown v. Board of Education was a Supreme Court case which had the ultimate goal of desegregating schools. The overall case consisted of 5 separate cases which the Supreme Court had listened to. This case had lasted for 2 years from December 9, 1952 to May 17, 1954. The court had reached the decision that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional and should therefore be illegal. The decision of the court was a success for African Americans as they now were able to attend the same schools with their white counterparts. On January 29, 2009, the citizens of the United States of America had elected their first African American president, President Barack Obama. Before becoming president, Obama had served as a senator for the state of Illinois from 2005 to 2008. He served 8 years in office and defied all of the odds. In 2009, Obama had won a Nobel Peace Prize for his extraordinary efforts to strengthen diplomatic relations between international people. Carol Moseley Braun, born on August 16, 1947, was a Chicago native who would later represent the state of Illinois in the Senate. Although she was not the first African American to represent a state in the Senate, she was the first African American female to do so. Her time in the Senate ranged from 1993 to 1999. During this time, she worked on gun control, progressive education bills, and much more. Segregation, which is the act of setting a person or group of people apart from others, can be seen throughout African American history ever since the first African slaves were brought to the shores. African Americans were segregated in many ways. Schools, restaurants, buses, public spaces, water fountains, and more were all separated by your skin color. Legislators made it legal in many cases for segregation to occur. In the South, the Jim Crow laws were passed, which allowed Caucasians to legally oppress and segregate African Americans. Many of the colored-only institutes and buildings were not built with the same technology or foundations as those which were white-only. This led to an obstacle in the advancement of African Americans, as many had to face violence from authorities for pursuing basic rights such as education or owning a business. Discrimination, which is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, etc., especially based on race and gender, has been an ever-growing problem for African Americans. African Americans often get discriminated against for their features, hair, sense of style, and much more. Due to many making unintelligent decisions only based on stereotypes and fears, discrimination, which is still very prevalent to this day, has been and is continuing to be a problem which African Americans must face. One of the largest problems which all minorities face is racism. Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Along with discrimination and segregation, African Americans face racism in almost all aspects of their lives, especially if they live in the Deep South. Blackface, which is when someone who is not of African descent paints their face and body all black, is an example of racism. Jealousy, hatred, fears, and stereotypes fuel racism. Until we can put out that fire, African Americans will continue to face this problem. Many African Americans have been wrongfully convicted and accused of committing crimes they didn't commit. Many African Americans were accused and convicted of committing atrocious crimes against whites. For example, the Scottsboro Boys are a prime example of being accused of a crime they did not commit. On a train ride, a group of African American boys got into an argument with a group of white boys. Due to this, the police rounded the boys up and brought them in for questioning. 2 girls who were also on the train had accused them of gang raping them, and the boys were found guilty by an all-white jury. Even though one of those who had accused them of raping her came forward and said that it was all fake, the boys were still found guilty, until the Alabama legislature introduced a bill to exonerate the boys. In some cases, African Americans were tortured until they confessed, as is the case with Ed Brown, Arthur Ellington, and Henry Shields. Such events also caused African Americans to be wrongfully convicted, as is the case with Lena Baker. African Americans have had to face many different hate groups during the years before and after slavery. For example, the Ku Klux Klan, skinheads, and neo-Nazis. These hate groups made it their goal to make lives for African Americans difficult. In 1736, the first recorded settlement of Filipinos had been recorded. Aboard the Spanish ship Manila, Filipino immigrants had jumped off the ship around New Orleans and had fled to the bayous of Louisiana. Here, they settled and built houses with Manila-styled roofs. In 1815, Chinese immigrants, mostly merchants and former sailors, had arrived in the United States. Many came to strike fortune and gain their riches what they had lost at home. More Chinese immigrants began to arrive during the 1850s due to the California gold rush. Chinese immigrants not only worked on mining, they had also helped in building the Transcontinental Railroad. At first, Japanese immigrants had moved to Hawaii during the first year of the Meiji period in 1886. Many, however, moved to Oregon, Washington, and California to pursue lives as fishermen and farmers. Here, they developed their own communities as well as educational and economical/business opportunities for themselves. In 1903, a shipload of Koreans had arrived in Hawaii to work on pineapple and sugar plantations. By 1905, there were 7,266 Koreans in Hawaii. Due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we will talk about later, plantation owners in Hawaii weren't allowed to recruit Chinese immigrants. Instead, they had recruited the Japanese and the Korean. When their work pass expired, many Korean immigrants moved to the mainland and hoped to find jobs. Early Vietnamese immigrants were known as boat refugee people. These immigrants were fleeing prosecution or were seeking economic opportunities. The mass influx of Vietnamese immigrants came after the fall of Saigon. This led to a U.S. evacuation of 125,000 Vietnamese. With the increasement of displacement in Vietnam, more Vietnamese immigrants were admitted to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was an act which had restricted Chinese immigration into the United States. This act had caused a 10-year absolute moratorium on Chinese activity. The overall reasoning of the act being passed was on the premise that Chinese immigrants had posed a threat to certain localities. This law had made it difficult for Chinese who were both skilled and unskilled to enter the country, as Chinese laborers were both skilled and some were unskilled. After the act was repealed in 1902, Chinese immigrants were required to have certificates saying that they were residents and/or citizens. Otherwise, they were at risk of deportation. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave an executive order, which was that citizens of Japanese descent were to be interred in isolated camps. This order was signed with the intent to prevent anything similar to Pearl Harbor from happening on the mainland. Japanese American citizens had lost their jobs, their houses, and their livelihood. In the camps, however, they were able to create their own schools with the resources they had. Oriental Exclusion Act was an act which prevented the immigration of Asians into the United States. This act, which was not appealed until 1943, had attempted to minimize the number of Asian immigrants the United States would have. This act, however, did not pertain to picture brides, who were women of Oriental descent sent to the United States for the sole purpose of being married off. Following the many exclusion acts and overall dislikement for those who are different from them, Asian Americans have been facing racism ever since they landed in New Orleans. Just as blacks, Asians weren't allowed to star in Hollywood films for a while, which resulted in white actors being casted and put into yellowface. Asian Americans were also subject to hate crimes, including vandalism and getting beat up. In most Asian cultures, respect is highly valued and everyone works together for the greater good. In America, respect is only valued for certain groups. Life in America is competitive and does not have equal opportunities for all, as many had initially thought when making the move to the States. Americans had attempted to assimilate the incoming immigrants, which was a challenge for them as many did not want to give up their culture and heritage. In 2016, 14 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were voted into Congress. Kamala Harris was the first Indian American woman to become senator. Pramila Jayapal became the first Indian American elected into the House of Representatives. Stephanie Murphy was the first Vietnamese American elected into Congress. Many more Asian Americans and other minority groups have been represented in our governments as well. The TV show Fresh Off the Boat, which was first aired in 2015, is a show in which the Huang family had just arrived in the United States from China. This show not only has all of the lead characters having Asian descent, but the show also challenges cultural arrogance, cultural appropriation, as well as racism. The movie Crazy Rich Asians was the first movie in 25 years which had an all-Asian cast. The first being The Joy Luck Club, which was produced in 1993. Disney came out with the movies Mulan and Moana. In the movie Mulan, you follow a young Chinese girl named Mulan, or Ming Na Wen, who disguises herself as a male to enter the Chinese military in order to take her father's place. Unlike other Disney princesses, Mulan is a character who is daring, strong-willed, determined, and doesn't need a man to come rescue her all the time. Even in the live action, Disney had casted actors of Asian descent to play the characters. In Moana, the setting is on a Pacific island and follows the story of an island girl named Moana who sets out to save her people. There are many Asian actors who are in the comedy business, such as Aziz Ansari, who can be found on Parks and Recreation, and Alan Yang, who created the Netflix series Masters of None with Aziz Ansari. The two had won Emmy Awards for their show, but that's not all. Asian actors such as Aziz, Constance Wu, and Daniel Dae Kim protest about the whitewashing which occurs in Hollywood. Aya Lin, who is an architect/designer, had received a Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. The award was given to her for her career achievements, including the designing of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. St. Augustine had brought the first European settlement to the United States and introduced Catholicism and Spanish language to Florida. With him was Pedro Méndez de Avilés, who had helped to build the settlement of St. Augustine. The city was founded as Pedro was looking for the legendary Fountain of Youth. On September 16, 1810, a Mexican priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla had launched the Mexican War of Independence from Spain. He had issued the Grito de Dolores, or Cry of the Dolores, which had called for the end of Spanish rule on Mexico, redistribution of land, and racial equality. Costilla was found, tried, and executed, but the separatist movement continued with other leaders such as Jose Maria Morelos and more. Texas was once a part of Mexico, that is, until it was annexed to the United States in 1845. At first, Texas was given to the Union and didn't become a state until December 29th of that year. The annexing of Texas had angered the Mexican government as they had lost a large quantity of land. Due to this, tension and conflicts over the official border lines arose. The Mexican-American War was the war in which then U.S. President James K. Polk believed that the United States had a manifest destiny to spread across the country to the Pacific Ocean. The result of the war was Mexico losing about one-third of their territory, which included almost all of California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. The cause of the war was America's expansion westward, as they were going to be entering Mexican territory. In 1901, the Platt Amendment was an agreement between the United States and Cuba, which had stated that the United States reserves the rights to build a Navy base in Cuba. It also stated that Cuba is not to sign any other treaties with other countries unless the United States has deemed it okay. The same goes with borrowing money from other countries. With this, the United States government handed over the Cuban government to the people of Cuba. Hispanic Americans have always faced discrimination, especially now. There have been many debates on the topic of immigration and whether or not families should be separated at the border. This topic has always been around. However, in 1931, police officers had grabbed Mexican American citizens and deported them, no matter what their citizenship status was. As Latino and Hispanic immigration grew, so did the anti-Latino propaganda. The other minority groups, Hispanic Americans, have stereotypes about them, most being harmful and completely false. Hollywood has taken advantage of some of these stereotypes and utilized them in their shows and movies. For example, the stereotype that all Latinos and Hispanic Americans can't control their temper leads many who've never met any Hispanics or Latinos believe that this is true. In Modern Family, Sofia Vergara, who plays Gloria on The Modern Family, always seems to be losing her temper. The other stereotype which is harmful to Hispanic Americans is that Hispanic Americans work as gardeners, maids, and janitors. The belief that all Hispanic Americans are illegal is also a challenge for this minority. Hispanics are disproportionately impacted by the abuses and biases in the existing criminal justice system, both as victims and as the accused. Latinos and African Americans face aggressive police practices. For example, the Supreme Court upheld Arizona's Show Me Your Papers law that allows officers to check the immigration status of suspects. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division also found that the East Haven, Connecticut police force discriminated against Latinos, treating Hispanic drivers more harshly and targeting them for traffic enforcement. Latinos face barriers when it comes to accessing quality healthcare. Aside from the fact that Latinos are disproportionately uninsured, they also have trouble finding doctors who speak Spanish, if that's something they want or need. They are also more likely to have diabetes and certain types of cancer, which is especially dangerous given that many uninsured people don't have the ability to access the regular care they need to manage such treatments. Latinos and African Americans are more likely to live in a neighborhood with lower home ownership rates, higher poverty rates, and even fewer grocery stores and transportation options. Latinos have also been disproportionately affected by the foreclosure crisis. Some of that has to do with predatory lending practices, and some of it is from pure discrimination. Los Angeles, which was historically home to the true mess in Tongva, was claimed by Juan Rodriguez Carbillo for Spain in 1542, along with the rest of what would become Alta California. The city was officially founded on September 4, 1781, by Spanish Governor Felipe de Neve. The new settlement consisted of 11 descendants from Spanish families, also called Los Pobladores. March 2, 1917, the Jones-Shafroth Act was signed, collectively making Puerto Ricans United States citizens without renouncing their Puerto Rican citizenship. The Jones-Shafroth Act was signed by Woodrow Wilson and had guaranteed dual citizenship for Puerto Ricans. This act gave Puerto Ricans benefits which American citizens have, as well as letting them keep those which Puerto Rican citizens have. Joseph Marion Hernandez became the first Hispanic American to serve in Congress when Florida became a territory in 1822. Shortly after him, Judah P. Benjamin served in the Senate, followed by Octaviano Larrazolo, who was a former governor of Mexico. Following him were Dennis Chavez and Joseph Monotoya. These five are at the start of the long line of Hispanics in government. In 1965, Filipino and Latino farm worker unions joined in a strike, and later a boycott of grapes in the Delano area of California to protest poor conditions. The 5-year campaign ultimately succeeded in forcing the grape producers to sign union contracts. This early victory helped secure the place of the United Farm Works and its leader, Cesar Chavez, all of whom were key players in the Latino civil rights movement. Champion of Black and Hispanic rights, who began his career before the end of segregation, Roberto Clemente was the first Latino in pro baseball to achieve 3,000 hits. The trailblazing Puerto Rican-born ball player not only built a stellar career, but also acted as a politically conscious representative of the Latino community at a time when professional sports included few Hispanics. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and landed in the unknown land, or North America. Not knowing where he was, he had believed that he had landed in the West Indies. He had described the natives he met as Indians, and on the first day, he ordered 6 natives to be seized as servants. In 1613, Pocahontas was kidnapped by Englishman Samuel Argall, who had lured her onto a ship during the First Anglo-Powhatan War. Captain Argall had informed Pocahontas' father that he would only return Pocahontas if he released English prisoners, returned stolen weapons, and sent the colonists food. Much to Pocahontas' dismay, her father only sent the half of the ransom and left her imprisoned. Pocahontas lived in the settlement of Henricus, under the care of a minister named Alexander Whitaker, where she learned about Christianity, English culture, and how to speak English. Pocahontas converted to Christianity, was baptized, and then given the name Rebecca. May 15, 1756, the 7-year war between the British and the French began. Native American alliances were aiding the French. This war was also known as the French-Indian War. The French-Indian War took place due to some imperial struggle between France and Britain. During this war, some Native Americans were sided with the French as they did not want to lose their land to the British. Others sided with the British so that they wouldn't lose their land, and a few remained neutral. The treaty, which was signed in Georgia in 1785, had protected Cherokee Native Americans and had sectioned off their land. The treaty was signed on Hopo Plantation, which belonged to Andrew Pickens. Here, 3 treaties were signed. The overall promise in the treaty was that the United States government would protect the Cherokee from whites attempting to take their land. 1791, the Treaty of Holston was signed, which had stated that the Cherokee must give up all of their land outside of the boundaries which were discussed and established earlier. This treaty ended up helping with the creation of the city Knoxville in Tennessee. On June 2, 1924, Congress granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the U.S. But they're Native Americans, so I kind of don't understand. Anyways, after this act was passed, many Native Americans weren't allowed to vote as it was governed by state law, instead of national law. This act was proposed by Homer P. Snyder and was signed by Calvin Coolidge. Luther Standing Bear was born in December 1868 and died on February 20, 1939. He was a Sikango and Ogallala Lakota chief, but he was also known in American history as a Native American author, educator, philosopher, and an actor in the 20th century. His books include Stories of the Sioux, Land of the Spotted Eagle, My Indian Boyhood, and My People of the Sioux. The Battle of Little Bighorn, which took place June 25th through 26th of the year 1876, was an event which is also known as Custer's Last Stand. George Custer was a military general whose intent was to massacre all of the Native Americans who were camped in Little Bighorn Valley. George Custer took his little 600 men to attempt to kill more than 1,000 Native Americans. Native American chief Crazy Horse and his warriors clashed with Custer and his men head on and killed each and every one of them. Niles Allen, or Boo Boo Stewart Jr., is an American actor. He is known for playing Seth Clearwater, a werewolf in the Twilight Saga, Warpath in X-Men Days of the Future Past, and Jay in the Disney television films Descendants, Descendants 2, and Descendants 3. He is from Russian, Native American, and Scottish descent. Born on August 1st, 1979, Jason Momoa is an American actor who starred in films and TV shows such as Aquaman and Frontier. His father is of Native Hawaiian descent, and his mother is of German, Irish, and Native American descent. He has played roles which embrace his native background, such as his role in Frontier. He has also said that he keeps his hair long due to his native ancestry. Probably one of the most easiest challenges to recognize, colonizers played a large challenge for Native Americans. Colonizers had many diseases which Native Americans had little to no immunity to. Colonizers ended up killing around 90% of the Native American population. Diseases passed through social interaction and infected blankets were all challenges Native Americans had. Reservations are areas of land which are managed by a Native American tribe under the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. Before urbanization and exploration, Native Americans had roamed the lands and lived as nomads. Reservations posed a challenge for Native Americans as it took away Native Americans' sense of identity and overall livelihood. The westward expansion was a major challenge in Native American history. The westward expansion consisted of Americans and African Americans moving westward in order to obtain more land, fortune, and opportunity. On the trail, wild buffalo were shot and killed for fun, which was lowering the amount of food sources for Native Americans. The farther west people went, the less amount of land was available for Native Americans. Cultural appropriation is the adoption of the iconography of another culture and using it for another culture and for purposes that are unintended by the original culture or even offensive to that culture's morals. This can be a challenge for Native Americans because one of the different culture can adopt the iconography of the Native Americans' cultures. An example of cultural appropriation towards Native American culture is the fact that these days Native American symbols are everywhere. Think about all of those college and high school football teams and their mascots. Another example of cultural appropriation of Native Americans is the non-Native Americans belonging to the hipster subculture generally appropriate in an effort to appear worldly. Due to a sincere lack of education, these efforts appear offensive and insensitive. Many hipster subcultural members wear the Plains Indians' Native American headdresses in a highly sexualized manner, which perpetuates stereotypes of Native American women and strips the headdress of the spiritual significance. As other minority groups, Native Americans have had to face racism. Native Americans who serve in the military often do not walk in the commemorable parades, while other minorities do. Traces of discrimination can also be found. In Rapid City, a Native American, Evelyn Ridge Lodge, recalls her encounter with revisiting her own hometown. Just walking downtown in Rapid City, that so-called city of presidents, I spot the stores along the way that used to sport signs saying, "No Indians or dogs allowed." I go to Hill Sapa, the Black Mountains, where I look upon the faces of the past presidents who helped wipe out so many indigenous peoples.